Welcome to History and Ashes. This is the place where you and I walk through the past together, where the forgotten dust of history is stirred gently until it tells us the stories we need to remember. Today, you are about to step into one of the darkest industrial disasters in human history, a night when an invisible poison rolled through a sleeping city. This is Bhopal, India, in December of 1984. But before we drift too deeply into this night, I want to ask you something small. Could you slip down into the comments and tell me where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now? I always find it fascinating to imagine how history is reaching across the world in this moment. And while you are there, you might consider subscribing to the channel. I promise you, unlike Union Carbide, we do not cut corners on safety. You can breathe here without worrying about toxic clouds, though you may suffocate under the weight of long-forgotten facts. Go on, subscribe before the history alarms start ringing. Now, imagine you are asleep in your bed in Bhopal on the night of December 3rd, 1984. The air outside is still, as it often is during winter in central India. The streets are quiet, the city is at rest. Yet, inside the Union Carbide pesticide plant, something has gone terribly wrong. A tank holding methyl isocyanate known simply as MIC has become unstable. Water has leaked into it, triggering a runaway chemical reaction. Pressure is building, heat is rising, and a deadly gas is forming in quantities no one had ever prepared for. At first, workers inside the plant notice a burning sensation in their eyes and throats. Some begin coughing uncontrollably. The alarms ring briefly, then are silenced. Outside the factory walls, the invisible cloud begins to drift, heavy and low, hugging the ground as it rolls into nearby neighborhoods. Within minutes, entire families wake up choking, their lungs seared by the gas. Many rush into the streets, clutching their throats, eyes streaming with tears, some collapsing before they can take 10 steps. Others stumble blindly, guided only by the sound of neighbors coughing, crying, and calling out in panic. You might wonder, what exactly does methyl isocyanate do to the human body? It is not a household name, but in this moment it becomes unforgettable for those who inhale it. The chemical irritates the respiratory tract, causes the lungs to fill with fluid, burns the eyes, and in high doses shuts down breathing altogether. The victims are not soldiers on a battlefield, they are shopkeepers, rickshaw drivers, children, and elderly women asleep on rooftops. The gas is colorless, but its effects are immediate. You cannot escape it by running, because the cloud hugs the ground, following you through the alleys and streets. Doctors later said that many people died within minutes, while others lingered for hours, suffocating slowly as their lungs collapsed. Animals fell in the streets, cows and dogs dropping alongside their owners. The city itself became a kind of open-air morgue before dawn. Imagine waking up to this, your neighbors pounding on your door, the sound of hacking coughs outside, and a sharp burning in your throat before you can even understand what is happening. Do you stay inside and seal the windows, or do you run into the street and risk being consumed by the cloud? In truth, there was no good choice. The gas did not strike evenly. Some areas closer to the plant were overwhelmed instantly, while neighborhoods farther away felt the effects as the cloud thinned but spread. Those living in shanty settlements, closest to the factory, many of them migrant workers, were hit hardest. Entire families died together, unable to flee. In some households, parents carried their children into the open air, only to collapse alongside them. Witnesses described scenes so surreal they seemed impossible. Bodies lying in rows by the roadside, rickshaws overturned as their drivers tried to escape, and even birds dropping from the sky. As the night deepened, hospitals across Bhopal began filling with the sick, but doctors did not know what chemical they were dealing with. Union Carbide had not shared clear information about the toxicity of methyl isocyanate. The only instruction doctors received in those early hours was to wash the patient's eyes with water. Yet patients were flooding in by the hundreds, then thousands, many of them barely conscious. The medical staff had no antidote, no guidelines, and no equipment to handle a chemical disaster of this magnitude. For the survivors who lived through those first hours, memory of the night never faded. Some described it as though the air itself had turned against them, as though breathing was suddenly a betrayal by their own bodies. Others remembered running through the dark, holding children who had already gone limp, yet refusing to let them go. In the silence of later years, these stories would emerge as testimonies in courtrooms and newspapers. But on that night, They were simply the lived reality of an entire city gasping for air. By dawn, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. Streets were lined with bodies, hospitals were overflowing, survivors wandered in shock, their eyes swollen shut, coughing up blood, clutching relatives who no longer moved. Officials hesitated to release information, fearing panic, but panic had already consumed the city. Union Carbide, meanwhile, attempted to downplay the incident, describing it as a minor leak, yet the number of deaths climbed so rapidly that denial became impossible. When you think about 25,000 lives eventually lost, it is tempting to treat it as a statistic, a large and incomprehensible figure. But imagine each of those lives as a story cut short: a father who would not return from the market, a mother who had just put her children to sleep, a student dreaming of exams, an old man remembering his youth. Each one was erased in a single night, not by war or famine, but by a company producing pesticides for cotton fields. And yet this was not an accident in the purest sense of the word. The warning signs had been there for months, even years. Workers had complained about corroded pipelines, faulty safety systems, and the storage of massive quantities of methyl isocyanate in poorly maintained tanks. Local newspapers had raised questions about whether the plant was safe, but economic growth and industrial pride had overshadowed these concerns. In the pursuit of pesticides to feed crops, the risks to human life had been ignored until they became undeniable. This is how history sometimes unfolds, not in the grand speeches of leaders or the clash of armies, but in the unnoticed decay of bolts and valves, in the overlooked details of chemical storage, in the bureaucratic silence when alarms are switched off. These small failures add up, until one night, they suddenly manifest as the death of thousands. As you lie here listening, perhaps drifting towards sleep, ask yourself, what makes disasters like Bhopal possible? Is it the failure of machines, the negligence of managers, the hunger of nations for industrial progress, or the quiet assumption that someone else will take responsibility? If you and I are to understand what happened in Bhopal on that night in December 1984, we need to walk the streets of the city before the disaster. It is too easy to think of a tragedy only in terms of its explosion, its climax, the gas, and the chaos. But history is not only about the night everything collapsed. It is also about the years of quiet living that preceded it, the ordinary days and routines that gave no warning of what was to come. So let us take a step back. Before the toxic cloud rolled through Bhopal, what kind of city was it? What kind of lives were lived in the shadow of the Union Carbide plant? Bhopal, the capital of Madhya Pradesh, sat like a patchwork of old and new. In the 1970s and 80s, it was not yet the bustling metropolis it would later become. At its core, it remained a city of lakes and mosques, an old princely state with its own rhythm of life. The upper lake and the lower lake divided the city, and people spoke of them almost like living companions. Water from these lakes had sustained generations, and fishing on their banks was a sight as ordinary as children playing cricket in the narrow lanes. The old city was crowded and intimate. You could walk down Chowk Bazaar and hear the calls of merchants selling spices, vegetables, and cloth, all jostling for attention. The air would carry a mixture of scents, fried snacks from roadside stalls, the earthy smell of wet stone after the evening sprinkling of water on dusty streets, and the occasional aroma of incense drifting from a small shrine tucked between shops. Rickshaw pullers rested under neem trees, gossip moved faster than bicycles, and neighbours leaned out of balconies to exchange news. But this was not a static world. The 1970s had brought changes to Bhopal. India, newly independent for just a few decades, was pushing toward industrialization, toward the idea that factories and technology would make the country strong and self-reliant. The Green Revolution was underway. High-yield crops promised to feed the nation, but they demanded pesticides and fertilizers in vast quantities. In that atmosphere, chemical plants seemed like symbols of progress. Union Carbide, an American multinational, arrived in Bhopal in the late 1960s with the promise of jobs, development, and modernity. For a city where many lived in poverty and unemployment was high, the prospect of a large industrial employer felt like a blessing. The factory was built on the northern edge of the city, not far from densely populated settlements. At the time, the land seemed peripheral, a zone between the old neighborhoods and open fields. Few could have imagined that the city would grow and sprawl right up to its walls. When the plant opened, it was hailed as an opportunity. Union Carbide India Limited, as the subsidiary was known, was going to manufacture pesticides to help Indian farmers protect their crops. The pesticide produced there was called Sevin, a carbaryl compound. To produce it cheaply, the factory imported and later manufactured methyl isocyanate as an intermediate chemical. On paper, the technology was advanced, efficient, and globally competitive. For local workers, the job seemed stable, respectable, and even enviable. But walk through the settlements around the plant, and you would see a different picture. Many of those living nearby were migrant laborers who had come to Bhopal in search of work. They built huts from brick, tin, or even plastic sheeting, forming clusters of informal colonies. Their proximity to the factory was not accidental. Being close meant that husbands or sons could walk to their shifts, that women could take in laundry from plant workers, and that children could fetch water for families who labored on construction sites or as vendors in the market. Living near the plant was convenient, even if it was crowded and lacked proper sanitation. The contrast between the promise of the factory and the reality of life around it is one of the quieter but more significant details of the story. Inside, the factory walls were machines imported from abroad, storage tanks, chemical reactors, and safety systems described in technical manuals. Outside the walls were families living without reliable electricity, sometimes without running water. To them, the looming structures of the plant were not symbols of danger, but of hope, the kind of industrial modernity that might one day lift them into security. You might imagine an evening in 1978. A worker has just finished his shift at Union Carbide, where he has spent the day checking gauges or stirring vats. He steps out, washes his hands at a tap near the gate, and walks back into his neighborhood where his wife is cooking dal on a kerosene stove. The children are playing with sticks and a worn-out cricket ball. The family eats together, with the sound of the plant's machinery humming faintly in the background. It was not an unusual life, and nothing in it suggested that this setting would one day be ground zero of an industrial massacre. To understand why the plant was accepted into the heart of the city, you need to think about the Indian economy of the time. In the decades after independence, India had been cautious with foreign companies. But by the 1970s, foreign investment was seen as a way to modernize quickly. Pesticides were framed as part of a national mission to feed millions. Local leaders in Bhopal welcomed Union Carbide because it promised not only jobs, but also prestige proof that their city was part of India's modern transformation. There were warnings, though. Long before the leak, residents had complained of occasional odors drifting from the plant, acrid smells that irritated the eyes and nose. Sometimes, livestock fell sick. Local journalists, too, wrote pieces questioning the safety of storing large amounts of hazardous chemicals in a plant so close to human settlements. But these articles rarely gained traction beyond a few columns. To the average resident, the complaints felt minor compared to the benefits of industry. After all, who could afford to think about unseen dangers when putting food on the table was already a daily concern? Even the workers inside the plant noticed troubling signs. Equipment was not always maintained properly, and safety drills were infrequent. But in an environment where jobs were scarce, speaking out could mean risking your livelihood. And so, the plant kept running, the tanks kept filling with methyl isocyanate, and the settlements outside the walls kept growing, one hut and one family at a time. Daily life in Bhopal moved forward with the ordinary weight of existence. In the mornings, government clerks hurried to their offices. Students cycled to school, books strapped to their backs. Women gathered at communal taps, filling brass pots and catching up on gossip. The call to prayer echoed from mosques, while temple bells rang in other corners of the city. Festivals lit up the streets with fireworks and music. If you had visited Bhopal in the late 1970s, you would have seen a city that seemed alive with possibility, a place where old traditions and new ambitions met every day. And yet, in hindsight, the picture is heavy with irony. The very neighborhoods that bustled with life, JP Nagar, Chola, Arif Nagar, were the ones closest to the Union Carbide plant. These communities would later be the hardest hit, the first to breathe in the toxic cloud. But in the years before 1984, the residents of these colonies were not thinking about disaster. They were thinking about rent, about feeding their families, about whether their children might study enough to move into better jobs. Safety regulations, chemical storage limits, and international corporate liability were abstract ideas, far removed from the immediate concerns of survival. This is one of the quiet truths of history, that the most devastating events often strike those who are least equipped to imagine them. The people of Bhopal were not ignorant, but they were busy living lives constrained by poverty, opportunity, and the ordinary concerns of daily survival. The plant was just another neighbor, one whose presence was tolerated because it seemed to offer more benefits than risks. So when you think of Bhopal before the gas leak, do not imagine a city already broken. Imagine instead a city alive with routine, its streets full of sounds, its lakes reflecting the sky, its people working, struggling, and hoping for a better tomorrow. And ask yourself how many other cities, even today, live in the shadow of industries they do not fully understand, trusting that the invisible walls of safety will hold. When you think of Bhopal in the years before the gas leak, you must also think of Union Carbide itself, because the company's presence was not just local, it was global. Union Carbide was founded in the United States in the early 20th century, and by the mid-century it had become one of the giants of the chemical industry. Its products were everywhere: plastics, batteries, chemicals, pesticides. In the years after the Second World War, when industry was booming and consumer demand seemed limitless, Union Carbide expanded aggressively. The company's name carried with it an aura of modernity, of science harnessed for progress. To understand why Union Carbide came to India, you must understand the economic mood of the 1960s. India was still young as a republic, experimenting with economic models, balancing socialist planning with the need for industrial modernization. Food security was one of the most pressing challenges. Famines in the 1960s had shaken confidence, and the government launched the Green Revolution, an ambitious drive to increase crop yields through high-yield seeds, irrigation, fertilizers, and pesticides. For this revolution to succeed, India needed chemicals, and it needed them fast. Union Carbide saw opportunity. In 1969, it established Union Carbide India Limited, a subsidiary in which Indian shareholders also held a stake. The idea was to manufacture pesticides domestically, rather than relying on imports. For the government, it meant technology transfer and jobs. For Union Carbide, it meant a foothold in one of the world's largest and hungriest markets. Both sides thought they were investing in progress. The pesticide chosen for production in Bhopal was called Sevin, chemically known as carbaryl. It was marketed as a wonder chemical, effective against a wide range of crop pests. To produce Sevin, methyl isocyanate MIC was needed as an intermediate. At first, the MIC was imported, but later, to cut costs and appear more self-reliant, Union Carbide built facilities in Bhopal to manufacture and store it locally. This decision would prove to be one of the most consequential in the entire story. Union Carbide's arrival in Bhopal was greeted with optimism. Local newspapers spoke of modernization, of jobs for skilled and unskilled workers alike. Politicians praised the plant as a sign that India was stepping into an industrial future. For the company, it was a demonstration of its global reach. Yet, within this optimism lay the seeds of risk. The design of the Bhopal plant was not identical to the company's flagship facility in West Virginia. Cost-cutting meant modifications, some of which reduced the safety margins. Equipment was scaled down, and safety redundancies were limited. In corporate boardrooms, these were numbers on a budget sheet. On the ground in India, they became cracks in the armor meant to protect lives. It is here that you can see how decisions made far from Bhopal shaped the daily reality of the city. The choice to store large quantities of MIC, the choice to reduce investment in refrigeration and safety systems, the choice to delegate oversight to a subsidiary with fewer resources. All of these were decisions made in the pursuit of efficiency. No one imagined they were directly deciding the fate of 25,000 people. Yet this is how history often works. Tragedies are rarely the result of one decision alone, but of countless small ones layered together, each seeming reasonable at the time. Union Carbide was not alone in this pattern. Throughout the 20th century, multinational corporations expanded into developing nations, bringing technology but often lowering standards compared to their home operations. Environmental and safety regulations were weaker, enforcement was inconsistent, and poverty meant communities were more willing to accept risks in exchange for jobs. Bhopal was not unique in this sense. It was simply one of the places where the consequences became impossible to ignore. Inside the factory, the workers were aware of the gaps. Many of them were proud of their jobs, proud to be part of something that felt modern and scientific. But they also noticed when gauges malfunctioned, when leaks were patched roughly, when safety drills were neglected. Some spoke up, but their voices carried little weight against the machinery of corporate priorities. In a developing economy, complaints could be brushed aside as obstacles to progress. From the perspective of Union Carbide executives in the United States, the Bhopal plant was a small piece of a vast corporate puzzle. Reports from India were numbers and charts, production figures, and balance sheets. The local managers were trusted to handle operations. The executives were focused on global competitiveness, on staying ahead of rivals like DuPont or Bayer. Safety was a line item, not the headline. In this distance between headquarters and factory floor, a gap grew between responsibility and accountability, between design and reality. It is important to see this clearly, because the Bhopal tragedy was not a random accident of chemistry. It was the outcome of global economic forces, corporate strategies, and national ambitions intersecting in one place. Each layer of decision-making carried assumptions that technology was reliable, that workers could manage, that costs needed to be trimmed, that safety standards could be adapted to local conditions. These assumptions held until the night they collapsed, leaving behind silence and bodies in the streets. You might wonder, did no one question the wisdom of storing MIC in such large quantities? There were, in fact, voices of concern. Engineers noted that refrigeration units, meant to keep the chemical stable, were sometimes shut down to save money. The flare tower, designed to burn off escaping gas, was not always functional. Vent scrubbers, meant to neutralize leaks, were undermaintained. These were not secrets. They were facts known to those on the inside. But when brought up, they were dismissed as manageable risks. Why? Because corporations, like nations, often measure risk differently depending on who bears the consequences. For Union Carbide's executives, the risk was financial losses, lawsuits, bad press. For the workers and residents of Bhopal, the risk was life itself. And yet, the ones who bore the greater risk had the least power to shape the decisions. The irony is that Union Carbide promoted itself as a responsible modern company. Its advertisements spoke of progress, of feeding the world, of science in service to humanity. And in a sense, those slogans were not lies. Pesticides did increase crop yields. The Green Revolution did save millions from famine. But the same chemical processes that fed millions also had the potential to kill thousands when mishandled. In Bhopal, the line between progress and catastrophe turned out to be razor thin. If you close your eyes and imagine Bhopal in the late 1970s, you see the factory rising on the horizon, its towers and tanks a symbol of modern industry. But if you shift your view slightly, you see the crowded neighborhoods nearby, the children playing cricket in the dust, the women cooking meals in smoky kitchens, the men returning from shifts with tired faces. The factory was not a distant installation, it was woven into the daily life of the city. Its presence was as ordinary as the mosques and markets. This intertwining of corporate power and community vulnerability is not unique to Bhopal. Even today, factories, refineries, and chemical plants sit alongside neighborhoods around the world. Most days, nothing happens. Most nights, families sleep undisturbed. But history reminds us that when safety is compromised, when oversight fails, the consequences are not measured in profits or losses, but in lives extinguished. Union Carbide's story in India is, in some ways, a story of good intentions entangled with negligence. The company wanted to sell pesticides to help farmers. The government wanted jobs and technology. Workers wanted stable employment. Communities wanted better futures. None of these desires were inherently wrong, but layered together, combined with shortcuts, mismanagement, and global indifference, they created a setting where disaster was not only possible but, perhaps, inevitable. And so, as you lie here listening, think of how often history is shaped not by villains with grand designs, but by institutions following their logic, by companies chasing profit, by governments pursuing growth, by workers seeking stability. No one intended Bhopal to be a tragedy, yet intention is often irrelevant when the systems we build are fragile, and when those at the bottom bear the weight of risks created above them. So ask yourself, when a company builds a factory near a city, when it makes decisions about cost versus safety, when it measures human lives against financial margins, who gets to decide what is acceptable risk and who must live with the consequences? When you think about industrial disasters, it is tempting to imagine them as sudden explosions, as events that erupt out of nowhere. But the truth is often slower, quieter, and hidden in technical details that do not sound dramatic at all. Bhopal is a perfect example of this. At the center of the story is one chemical, methyl isocyanate, or MIC. On paper, it was nothing extraordinary, an industrial intermediate, a compound used to make pesticides that protected crops. But in practice, it was one of the most hazardous substances ever handled in civilian industry. Understanding why means understanding the way it was stored and the way safety systems were designed, and more importantly, the way those systems failed. Methyl isocyanate is a liquid at room temperature, but it evaporates easily and turns into a toxic gas. It is reactive, unstable in the presence of water, and dangerous to handle in large quantities. In the United States, the same Union Carbide company handled MIC with extreme caution. Tanks were kept small, refrigerated constantly, and surrounded by multiple safety systems. But in Bhopal, decisions were made that deviated from this standard. To save costs, the company stored MIC in massive underground tanks far larger than recommended. Each tank could hold many tons of the chemical, enough that a leak would endanger thousands. The tanks were equipped with safety systems. In theory, this should have been enough. There was a refrigeration unit, designed to keep the MIC cool and stable. There was a vent gas scrubber, meant to neutralize any gas that might escape. There was a flare tower, intended to burn off vapors before they could spread into the air. These layers of protection were supposed to ensure that even if something went wrong, the community outside the walls would remain safe. But here is where the small, boring details become fateful. By the early 1980s, the refrigeration unit was no longer always in operation. Running it consumed electricity, and in the drive to cut costs, managers often left it shut off. MIC was stored at higher temperatures than recommended, which meant it was more volatile, more reactive, and more dangerous. The vent gas scrubber, too, was not functioning at full capacity. It was under-maintained, and its efficiency was questionable even when operational. The flare tower, which was supposed to burn off gases, had also been reported as out of service at times. Each of these failures, on its own, might not have seemed catastrophic, but layered together, they formed a chain of vulnerabilities. Think of it like a house. You might have a lock on the door, a security alarm, and a guard dog. If the lock is broken, the alarm unwired, and the dog sick, your house still looks the same from the outside. But in reality, it is unprotected. The Bhopal plant looked like it had multiple safety systems. In reality, they were weakened, inactive, or insufficient. Another crucial detail was the location of the tanks themselves. Instead of being isolated far from residential areas, they sat within a plant bordered by neighborhoods. Informal housing settlements grew closer and closer over the years, until the wall of the factory was practically the backyard of some families. The danger of storing volatile chemicals in bulk, so close to so many people, was obvious to experts, but invisible to most of those who lived nearby. To them, the plant was just another factory, humming away like any other. Even within the plant, workers had noticed signs of risk. Leaks had occurred before small leaks of phosgene, of chlorine, of MIC itself. Some workers had fallen ill. One leak in 1982 exposed several employees, leading to hospitalizations. These incidents were warnings, red flags waving in plain sight. But each was treated as an isolated event, patched up, forgotten. The bigger picture, the fact that the storage of large amounts of MIC in poorly maintained systems was inherently unsafe, was not acted upon. The storage capacity itself was excessive. At the time of the disaster, the plant had hundreds of tons of MIC on site. Why so much? Because Union Carbide wanted to produce pesticides in bulk to reduce costs, and storing large amounts of MIC was part of that plan. In the United States, such storage volumes would never have been approved near a populated area. But in India, regulatory oversight was weaker, and permissions were granted. Here, history takes on its peculiar rhythm. The decision to save electricity by turning off refrigeration might have seemed like a minor budgetary adjustment. The failure to fully repair a flare tower might have seemed like a technical inconvenience. The decision to store extra MIC might have been celebrated as efficient planning. Each one, considered alone, was small, but together they created the conditions for catastrophe. The irony is that none of this was hidden. Workers knew the refrigeration was off. Engineers knew the scrubber was under-maintained. Local managers knew the flare tower was not always functional. Regulators had records of prior leaks. But in the daily grind of operations, these issues faded into the background, treated as normal rather than urgent. When nothing immediately disastrous happens, people grow accustomed to risk. Think of your own life for a moment. How often do we grow used to small malfunctions? A smoke alarm with a dead battery, a seatbelt buckle that sticks, a medicine bottle without a clear label. We notice, we shrug, and we tell ourselves it is fine for now. In industry, this pattern is magnified. Small risks accumulate until one day they are no longer small. MIC itself was rarely understood outside technical circles. Most residents of Bhopal had never heard of it. They might know the plant made pesticides, but few could name the chemicals inside. The word methyl isocyanate was not part of daily conversation, and so the danger was invisible not only physically but socially. A city cannot fear what it does not know, and corporations do not always rush to educate communities about invisible risks. In this way, Bhopal before the disaster was a place where ordinary people lived their lives under a hidden threat, one they did not recognize and could not prepare for. When the gas cloud finally rolled out of the tanks, it was not just the chemical reaction that killed. It was the years of overlooked details, deferred maintenance, and invisible decisions that made such a reaction possible. Later investigations would reveal just how preventable the disaster was. Safety standards applied in the United States were not followed in India. Warnings were ignored. Systems were degraded. Regulators did not enforce strict oversight. Each piece of the puzzle was a small failure, but together they formed a perfect storm. This is one of the quieter lessons of Bhopal, that disasters are not born in a single night. They are assembled slowly, in boardrooms, in maintenance reports, in budget sheets, in silent corners of factories where valves leak and gauges are ignored. By the time the gas escaped, the tragedy was already years in the making. As you listen, perhaps with your eyes growing heavy, reflect on how often history hides in these details. Not in the grand proclamations, not in the headlines, but in the neglected machines, the unwatched gauges, the forgotten safety systems. It was not fate that struck Bhopal in 1984. It was the sum of many choices, small and large, stretching back years. And so, let me leave you with a question. If human history can be undone by something as small as a neglected valve or a silent alarm, how many of today's silent risks are already shaping the tragedies of tomorrow? If you truly want to see the story of Bhopal clearly, you cannot stand only outside the factory walls. You must step inside, into the corridors of the Union Carbide plant itself, into the shoes of the men who worked there. These were not executives in suits or government officials behind desks. These were local workers, hired from Bhopal and the surrounding areas, trained to handle machines and chemicals that were, in many cases, new to them. Their daily experience tells us a side of the story that history books often compress into a few words: workers raised concerns. But in truth, those concerns were lived realities, repeated warnings that went unheard until it was too late. A typical day in the plant was a mixture of routine and vigilance. The workers monitored gauges, opened and closed valves, stirred mixtures, and checked tanks. The air inside the plant often carried the smell of chemicals, sharp, irritating, and unmistakable. For a trained chemist, these odors were signals, clues to possible leaks. For an ordinary worker, they were irritations to be endured, part of the cost of the job. Protective equipment was minimal. Masks, when available, were often basic cloth pieces, not designed to stop toxic fumes. Gloves were thin, boots sometimes worn out. The idea of comprehensive protective gear was almost theoretical. Workers were divided into shifts. Some labored through the heat of the day, others through the quiet of the night. Their wages were not high, but in a city where jobs were scarce, employment at Union Carbide was considered respectable. Many wore their plant uniforms with pride, knowing they had positions in a global company. They brought home steady pay, enough to keep food on the table, to send children to school, perhaps to afford small luxuries during festivals. The prestige of the job softened the reality that their work environment was hazardous. And hazardous it was. Leaks had happened before. In 1981, a worker named Ashraf Khan died after being exposed to phosgene gas inside the plant. He was cleaning a pipe when a valve leaked. His death was not hidden. It was known among the workers, spoken of quietly, but management treated it as an isolated incident, not a systemic problem. 2 years later, in 1982, another leak of phosgene sickened several workers, sending them to hospital beds. Around the same time, a small leak of methyl isocyanate exposed a handful of employees who survived but suffered lingering health effects. Each of these events was a warning, like small tremors before an earthquake. Workers recognized the danger. Some refused to take assignments they felt were too unsafe. Others complained about equipment that was corroded, about gauges that malfunctioned, about safety drills that were rarely held. But the power imbalance was stark. Management emphasized efficiency and cost-cutting. A worker who spoke too loudly risked being labeled difficult or worse, losing his job. In a city where unemployment was common, silence often felt safer than protest. This silence was not just individual, it was systemic. Within Union Carbide India Limited, decisions about maintenance budgets and safety priorities often tilted toward economy. By the early 1980s, the plant was running at reduced capacity, producing less than originally planned. Profits were under pressure. Cost-saving measures became more aggressive. This meant shutting down refrigeration for MIC tanks, reducing the size of maintenance teams, and letting safety drills lapse. For workers, these changes were visible, tangible, part of their daily environment, but their voices did not carry far enough to change the direction of policy. Imagine yourself as one of those workers. You arrive at the plant for a night shift. The air is cool, but inside the factory the smell of chemicals is sharp. You put on your uniform, perhaps adjust a cloth mask that you know is little more than a gesture. You take your place among pipes and tanks, watching gauges that do not always work correctly, listening for hissing sounds that signal leaks. You know that a broken valve can release something deadly, but you also know your family depends on this paycheck. And so you continue, balancing fear with necessity. Some of the workers developed strategies for survival. They learned to identify leaks by smell alone. They learned to recognize when a tank was unstable by the faint vibrations it gave off. They watched one another closely, ready to pull a colleague away if he collapsed. They knew that the emergency safety showers sometimes had no water pressure, that the first aid kits were sparse, that the doctors in the plant clinic had little training for chemical exposure, and so they relied on instinct and solidarity more than official systems. Even middle managers were caught in this pattern. Some sent reports up the chain, flagging concerns, but those reports often disappeared into the bureaucracy of the company, diluted or rephrased until they lost urgency. Others, aware of the problems, focused on keeping production going, calculating that the risk of a major disaster was low compared to the certainty of financial losses if operations slowed. One of the most revealing details is that after earlier leaks, local authorities were notified but did not act decisively. Regulatory inspections were infrequent and often superficial. Officials lacked technical expertise and sometimes accepted reassurances from the company without pressing further. Workers understood this. They knew they were alone in many ways, trapped between unsafe conditions and indifferent oversight. And yet, they continued to work, not because they were blind to the risks, but because life offered few alternatives. A steady job at Union Carbide, even with its dangers, was better than the uncertainty of day labor or unemployment. Families depended on those wages. Weddings, education, and medical expenses were financed with pay from the plant. To quit was to step back into insecurity. To speak out too loudly was to risk dismissal. And so, most chose the path of endurance. This is what makes the story of the workers so important. They were not reckless. They were not ignorant. They were trapped in a structure where their knowledge of danger was powerless against the machinery of profit and politics. They carried the burden of awareness silently, hoping that nothing catastrophic would happen, hoping that the small leaks and accidents were the worst they would ever see. When the night of December 3rd arrived, many of the workers were among the first to recognize what was happening. They knew the smell of MIC. They knew its burn in the eyes and throat. Some tried desperately to contain the reaction once water entered the storage tank, but the chain reaction was too powerful to stop. Others rushed to warn nearby neighborhoods, though their words were drowned in the chaos of the spreading gas. And some of those very workers died in the same cloud they had feared for years, their knowledge offering no protection against the scale of the release. In the end, the workers' story is a reminder of how disasters are experienced from below. They lived with the risk long before the world noticed it. They saw the cracks forming in the system, but lacked the power to repair them. They were, in many ways, the first victims not only on the night of the disaster, but in the years leading up to it. As their health was worn down by smaller exposures, as their warnings were ignored, as their lives were treated as expendable in the balance sheet of industry. So, as you lie here listening, perhaps imagining the rhythm of their days, ask yourself, how many warnings must be ignored? How many small accidents must be brushed aside before a system finally collapses? And when workers see danger but cannot act, who is truly responsible for what follows the men who turned the valves or the structures that left them no real choice? You must imagine the night of December 3rd as it began, for at first there was nothing extraordinary about it. The city of Bhopal was quiet, its streets cooling after the day's heat. Families had settled indoors, some preparing meals, others already in bed. The air was still. In the neighborhoods near the Union Carbide plant, children played for a while before drifting into sleep. Street vendors packed up their carts, the clatter of metal and wood echoing softly before silence fell. It was, in appearance, a peaceful night. But inside the plant, something was beginning. A routine maintenance operation had gone wrong. Water had entered a storage tank containing methyl isocyanate MIC, the chemical that workers feared most. MIC was supposed to be kept dry and under strict control, but cost-cutting had stripped away layers of safety. Refrigeration systems that could have slowed the reaction were shut down. The tank was overfilled, its gauges unreliable. And now, with water inside, a violent chemical reaction was building. At first, the signs were subtle. Workers noticed a faint hissing sound from the tank. The temperature readings climbed higher than expected. A few of the men felt irritation in their eyes and throats, as though smoke were drifting through the air. They knew what these signs meant. Some attempted to flush the tank, others debated whether to sound broader alarms. In those moments, hesitation mattered. Management had drilled into them that shutdowns and false alarms were costly. Production must continue. In the control room, the indicators flickered. Gauges were not always accurate, but that night, they told a story of pressure climbing beyond safe levels. Some workers argued for immediate emergency procedures. Others, trained to believe in corporate reassurances, hesitated. A mixture of fear and routine dulled the response. Beyond the plant walls, the city remained unaware. A few residents in the nearby railway colony noticed a strange smell drifting on the air. It was sharp, almost like chilies burning, but with something metallic and alien beneath it. Eyes began to sting. People coughed. Mothers checked on their sleeping children, frowning at the sudden irritation in their throats. A few stepped outside to investigate, only to find the air thicker, harsher. Inside the plant, chaos was growing. Workers tried to engage safety systems, but many were either broken, offline, or inadequate. The flare tower that could burn off escaping gas was not functioning properly. The vent gas scrubber, designed to neutralize chemicals before release, had been turned off to save money. As the reaction inside the tank grew violent, the pressure burst past what weak defenses remained. A plume of MIC gas surged out, invisible but deadly, carried on the night wind. The first people to feel it were the workers themselves. Some collapsed on the factory floor, their eyes burning, lungs seizing. Others staggered out of the gates, desperate for fresh air, coughing violently. They had no time to think of procedure or protocol. The gas was too fast, too overwhelming. In the neighborhoods downwind, the invisible cloud thickened. Families woke to a nightmare they could not see clearly. Eyes streamed with tears, throats closed as though gripped by unseen hands. Children began to vomit, their small bodies racked by violent spasms. Parents shook them, trying to wake them fully, not realizing that the very air was the enemy. Imagine yourself there. You are in bed, half asleep. A smell jolts you awake, burning your nostrils. Your eyes sting as though sand has been thrown into them. You cough and cough, but the coughing does not clear your throat. Instead, it grows worse. You stumble outside seeking clean air, but the night is thick with poison. Neighbors are shouting. Dogs are howling. Somewhere, a child screams. And everywhere, people are running, though they do not know where to go. Back inside the plant, attempts to contain the leak failed. The pressure had been too high, the systems too degraded. Workers tried opening valves, redirecting flows, anything to slow the release. But the gas escaped in massive volume, more than anyone could imagine, spreading quickly over the city. Some workers fled, guilt and fear in their chests. Others collapsed before they could escape. At the railway station nearby, passengers waiting for late-night trains felt the gas sweep through. Entire families staggered, coughing and blinded, clutching one another as panic spread. The station, usually a place of noise and bustle, turned into a scene of confusion, with people collapsing on the platforms, luggage abandoned in the rush to flee. For the people of Bhopal, the night was transforming into something unreal, a nightmare unfolding in slow motion. But unlike a nightmare, there was no waking up, no shaking off the terror. This was real. The air itself, essential for life, had turned into an enemy. And those first signs, the sting in the eyes, the choking in the throat, the sudden chaos in the streets, were only the beginning. It is important to understand that most did not know what was happening. They had no word for MIC, no training in chemical disasters. To them, the strange smell and burning sensations were inexplicable. Some thought it was a gas leak from the city pipes. Others imagined a fire in the factory. Few could grasp that they were in the middle of one of the deadliest industrial accidents in history. This ignorance was not their fault. The company had not warned the community about the chemicals stored so close to their homes. No evacuation drills had ever been conducted. No leaflets had been distributed to explain what to do in case of a leak. The people were defenseless, caught completely off guard. As the minutes passed, confusion deepened. Some ran north, others south, each hoping to outrun the choking air. Families became separated. Children slipped from their parents' hands in the chaos. Bodies fell in the streets, trampled by those still running. Rickshaw drivers tried to ferry people away, only to collapse themselves. Even animals, cows, dogs, goats were caught in the gas, their bodies littering the roads. The first signs, then, were not just chemical readings or hissing valves. They were human reactions, eyes stinging, lungs burning, voices crying out. The disaster announced itself not with sirens, but with the sound of thousands of throats gasping for air. And yet, in those early hours, there was still no coordinated warning, no official voice telling people what was happening. Confusion reigned, and confusion would prove deadly. The air thickened as the minutes passed after midnight, and the city of Bhopal became a place of confusion and terror. You would not have known where to run. The gas moved silently, settling in low-lying areas, flowing along streets and alleys. Some people ran uphill, instinctively seeking higher ground, while others fled wherever their feet carried them. In the darkness, families stumbled and collided, neighbors shouted one another's names, and cries for help rose above the coughing and retching. Imagine yourself barefoot on the cold pavement, your chest tightening with every breath. You cannot tell whether to stay indoors or flee outside. The air in your home is poisoned, yet the street is no safer. You clutch the hand of someone beside you, perhaps a child, perhaps a parent, but the grip loosens as dizziness overtakes you. Around you, others collapse, their bodies twitching as the gas seizes their lungs. You cannot stop to help, for every second matters. Survival means moving, though you do not know where safety lies. The roads filled with people. Rickshaws tipped over under the weight of families climbing aboard. Motorcycles weaved erratically through the crowd, their riders coughing violently, headlights flickering across faces twisted with fear. Carts abandoned by vendors earlier in the evening were overturned in the scramble, their contents crushed underfoot. Everywhere, belongings were dropped. Sandals, shawls, cooking pots grabbed in panic and then discarded. Some who fled sought refuge at the city's lakes. They plunged into the water, hoping it might protect them, only to find that the gas burned their skin and eyes even there. Others crowded into temples and mosques, believing sacred spaces might offer protection. But the gas respected no walls, no prayers. It slipped in everywhere, as silent as the night itself. The hospitals began to overflow almost immediately. Auto rickshaw drivers carried the first wave of victims, their vehicles crammed with families who had collapsed along the roads. Doctors and nurses on duty that night had no idea what they were facing. They had not been told about methyl isocyanate or its effects. They treated burning eyes and convulsions with whatever supplies they had: eye drops, oxygen masks, painkillers, but the numbers kept rising. Corridors filled with bodies, both living and dead. In the streets, confusion deepened. There was no official warning, no voice from the government or the company guiding people. Rumors spread instead. Some said a tanker had overturned. Others believed Pakistani planes had dropped chemical bombs. In the absence of truth, fear multiplied. Each person acted alone, deciding in the moment whether to run north or south, whether to carry a neighbor or abandon them. Animals joined the chaos. Cows staggered and fell in the roads, their great bodies blocking the way. Dogs howled in confusion before collapsing. Even the birds, startled from their perches, fluttered blindly through the toxic air, their wings failing mid-flight. The city that had once been alive with movement and noise was now filled with the sound of choking and the sight of bodies lying where they fell. Consider the irony. Bhopal was not a battlefield, yet it looked like one. No war had been declared, no soldiers had marched, yet people died in the streets as though bombs had fallen. It was industry, not warfare, that had unleashed the disaster. The same factory that had promised jobs and progress now delivered death. Some survivors later recalled running until they collapsed in exhaustion, waking hours later surrounded by silence and the bodies of others who had not risen again. Others remembered the taste of the gas, bitter and metallic, lingering in their mouths for days. Mothers spoke of carrying children who had stopped breathing mid-flight, unable to let go even when their own bodies gave out. These memories became part of the city's history, carried not only in official reports but in the private grief of thousands of families. The hospitals could not cope. Doctors shouted for more oxygen, for more antidotes, but none had been prepared. The company had never shared full details of the chemicals stored or their antidotes. The very information that might have saved lives was locked away, considered proprietary knowledge. As a result, treatment was improvised. Nurses rinsed eyes with water, placed damp cloths over faces, did whatever they could in the absence of guidance. The death toll mounted by the minute. Those who fled the city entirely often had little more than the clothes on their backs. They walked or ran for miles, coughing, their lungs burning, their vision blurred. Some collapsed by the roadside, their bodies later found far from home. Villages outside the city awoke to find strangers staggering in, begging for water and shelter. The scale of the panic is difficult to imagine now. Yet you can picture the city, lit only by dim street lamps, filled with tens of thousands of people moving as though pursued by an invisible predator. The gas was everywhere, and there was no map, no compass, to guide them away from it. In those hours, survival was not about cleverness or strength, but chance where you happened to be, which direction you ran, how much gas your lungs could endure. When dawn approached, the streets were littered with bodies. The movement slowed as exhaustion overcame. The living and the dead lay in silence, but the night itself had changed the city forever. It was no longer Bhopal as it had been. It had become something else, a place where tens of thousands suffered in darkness, caught unprepared by a disaster no one had warned them about. And in those final hours of the night, as the gas still lingered, questions rose silently. Could this have been prevented? Could more lives have been saved if warnings had been given? Or was the tragedy always waiting, built into the very structure of negligence and cost-cutting that had defined the plant? The night had been filled with noise, coughing, shouting, footsteps, the crash of bodies against the earth. By dawn, the sound was different. Silence clung to the city. The gas that had drifted through alleys and homes had left behind a stillness more unsettling than the chaos. If you had been there, you would have stepped out into the pale light of morning and seen a city transformed. The streets were littered with belongings dropped in flight sandals, shawls, half-eaten meals abandoned on doorsteps, and among them, bodies. People lay in positions that suggested movement halted suddenly, as though running one moment and collapsing the next. Some lay curled on the ground, clutching their throats. Others sat slumped against walls, eyes open but lifeless. The number was overwhelming. At first, you might think a few dozen. Then, as you walked further, hundreds. And beyond that, more still. Everywhere you looked, the signs of life interrupted. Cows dead in the streets, goats lying stiff in courtyards, chickens scattered, their feathers matted with dew. Dogs wandered aimlessly, their eyes red and swollen, some collapsing mid-step. The very fabric of daily existence had been stripped away, leaving behind a city half alive and half dead. Survivors stumbled through this landscape of loss. Many had no strength left to cry. Their throats were raw, their eyes swollen, their breathing shallow. Mothers carried children too weak to walk. Fathers held the hands of wives who no longer responded. Families searched frantically among the fallen, hoping to find relatives still alive, only to discover lifeless bodies instead. The grief was immediate and raw. but there was no time to pause. The living still needed care, though the hospitals were already beyond capacity. At Hamidia Hospital, the largest in the city, the corridors were packed. Bodies lay side by side on the floor, some breathing faintly, others still. Doctors had worked through the night, improvising treatments, but they had no supplies equal to the crisis. Oxygen cylinders were scarce, and what few remained were quickly emptied. The morgues filled, then overflowed, forcing workers to lay the dead outside in rows. By morning, the courtyards of hospitals resembled open-air graveyards. The city's officials were slow to respond. Some did not yet understand the scale of what had happened. Others hesitated, unsure of what information to release. No one gave clear instructions. Was it safe to return home? Should people remain outside? No answer came. The survivors, left on their own, searched for clarity in the faces of exhausted doctors, in the confused whispers of neighbors, in the stillness of the morning air. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some said the gas would return. Others insisted that water or milk could cleanse the body of poison. People washed themselves in the lakes and wells, desperate to rid their skin of the burning sensation, only to find little relief. Small crowds formed at temples and mosques, where priests and imams offered prayers, but even the holy men admitted they did not know what protection was possible. Beyond the city, trains passed along the tracks that cut through Bhopal. Passengers looked out from windows at the streets filled with bodies, at the thin line of smoke still drifting from the factory. They carried news of the disaster to the rest of India. By mid-morning, reporters began to arrive. Photographers captured images of streets filled with corpses, of children's bodies wrapped in sheets, of survivors with eyes swollen shut. Those photographs would later travel the world, shocking audiences who had never heard of methyl isocyanate or the Union Carbide plant until that day. The company itself released little information. Executives denied responsibility at first, suggesting sabotage or mysterious circumstances. Meanwhile, inside the city, the factory stood silent, its gates locked, its workers dispersed. The source of the disaster loomed in the background, its storage tanks still filled with chemicals, while the people in its shadow struggled to breathe. Consider what it would have felt like in those hours. You would have asked yourself whether the worst had passed. Was it safe to drink the water? Could you trust the air around you? The answer was unclear. Survivors later remembered the fear of breathing itself. Each breath felt like a risk, yet to stop breathing was not an option. So you inhaled cautiously, shallowly, waiting for some sign of safety that never came. By noon, the scale of the tragedy was undeniable. The death toll was already in the thousands, though no one knew the exact number. Officials began ordering mass cremations. Fires burned along the riversides and in open grounds as pyres were built hurriedly, stacked with the bodies of the unclaimed and the unidentified. In some cases, entire families were cremated together. The smoke from the pyres mixed with the lingering haze of the gas, creating an atmosphere heavy with both chemical and ritual fumes. Those who survived carried invisible wounds. Eyes that had been burned by the gas would suffer for years. Lungs scarred by the inhalation would never fully heal. Many miscarriages followed among pregnant women exposed that night. Children born afterward often carried deformities linked to the poisoning. But in that dawn of December 3rd, none of this was yet known. The focus was survival and mourning, though the two often overlapped. What makes the morning after so haunting is the contrast. The sun rose as it always did, casting light over the lakes, the temples, the bustling markets. But the markets were silent. The temples were crowded with mourners. The lakes reflected not fishermen or children swimming, but bodies floating in the shallows. The ordinary rhythm of the city had been replaced by something unfamiliar, something unrelenting. And in that light, the question began to form more clearly. Who was responsible? Was this the failure of a machine, the negligence of workers, or something larger, a system of industry that valued profit over precaution? Survivors could not answer that morning. They only knew what they had lost. Yet history would spend decades grappling with the question. When word of the disaster reached beyond the city, it carried the weight of disbelief. The idea that thousands could perish in a single night from a chemical leak seemed almost too vast to imagine. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Reporters arrived from Delhi and Bombay within hours. International journalists soon followed, their cameras capturing scenes that would appear on front pages around the world. Streets lined with corpses, funeral pyres burning without pause, hospitals spilling over with the gas-stricken. You would have seen their lenses searching not just for images of devastation, but for faces that told a larger truth, faces of survivors whose swollen eyes and shallow breaths testified to what no headline could fully capture. The Indian government, faced with mounting pressure, acted quickly on the surface. Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi ordered officials to the scene. Relief camps were established in schoolyards and public buildings. Doctors and nurses were rushed in from neighboring states, yet these efforts fell short almost immediately. The number of victims dwarfed the available aid. Hospitals lacked the most basic supplies: antibiotics, oxygen, saline. Volunteers distributed milk and water, believing these could neutralize the poison, though no evidence supported the practice. The tragedy exposed not just the leak itself, but the fragility of India's emergency response systems at the time. Meanwhile, Union Carbide, the American corporation that operated the pesticide plant, was thrust into the center of scrutiny. Company executives initially released statements suggesting sabotage by a disgruntled employee. This theory gained little traction among survivors, who knew the plant had been poorly maintained for years. Tanks of methyl isocyanate had been stored in conditions experts later described as reckless, high volumes of toxic gas, inadequate refrigeration, and malfunctioning safety systems. You might wonder how such oversight was possible. The answer lay in a chain of decisions shaped by cost-cutting and neglect, small choices that seemed routine until the night they proved catastrophic. On the ground in Bhopal, survivors demanded accountability. Crowds gathered outside the factory gates, chanting, carrying photographs of the dead, sometimes hurling stones at the walls. Police responded with barricades. Tensions rose, though most citizens were too weak, too grief-stricken, to sustain protests in those first days. For many, the immediate priority was the dignified burial or cremation of loved ones. The city's cremation grounds burned continuously, the air thick with ash. Each funeral marked not only the passing of an individual, but the collapse of entire families, entire lineages. The outside world reacted with shock. International organizations condemned the disaster as one of the worst industrial accidents in history. Comparisons were drawn to the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, not in cause but in human toll. Western newspapers questioned how such a catastrophe could occur in a modern industrial plant. Critics pointed to double standards. Safety regulations in Indian facilities were far looser than those in American ones, allowing corporations to cut corners where oversight was weak. The phrase, "third world dumping ground," began to appear in editorials, highlighting the unequal risks borne by poorer nations in the global economy. Legal action quickly followed. The Indian government, under the newly enacted Bhopal Gas Leak Disaster Act, claimed sole representation of the victims and filed a case against Union Carbide in American courts. The lawsuit sought billions in compensation, arguing that negligence had directly caused the disaster. Union Carbide countered by arguing jurisdiction and responsibility. They maintained that their Indian subsidiary bore local accountability. Thus began a long legal battle that stretched over decades, a battle that survivors watched from afar as their daily struggles for survival continued. Those daily struggles were harsh. Beyond the immediate deaths, 25,000 over time, according to later reports, tens of thousands were left with chronic illnesses. The gas had scarred lungs, damaged eyes, weakened immune systems. Survivors described constant coughing, burning in the chest, and visions so blurred that simple tasks became difficult. Women faced miscarriages, and children born in the months and years after carried a higher rate of deformities. Doctors in Bhopal began to see patterns: twisted limbs, weakened muscles, cognitive impairments. The tragedy was not only the mass death of one night, but the slow attrition of health across generations. And yet, amidst this devastation, resilience surfaced. Survivors formed local organizations demanding not just compensation but medical care, housing, and clean water. Grassroots movements, often led by widows who had lost husbands and children, became the backbone of advocacy in Bhopal. They met in small rooms, wrote petitions, marched to government offices. They insisted that the world not forget. Their efforts kept Bhopal in headlines long after the cameras had left, forcing both India and Union Carbide to face continued scrutiny. International solidarity also grew. Environmental activists pointed to Bhopal as a warning about unchecked industrial growth. The disaster became a symbol in global debates about corporate accountability, safety standards, and environmental justice. For students of history, it became a case study in how ordinary people bear the consequences of decisions made in boardrooms continents away. If you think about it carefully, you see the layers: the local grief of families who lost everything, the national struggle of a government facing its limits, the global reckoning with corporate responsibility. And hovering over all of it, the haunting question: could this have been prevented? The answer, historians and investigators insist, is yes, but prevention requires foresight, and foresight is often lost in the pursuit of profit. As the days turned into weeks, Bhopal transformed from a place of quiet mourning into a stage for politics, lawsuits, and activism. Yet the survivors themselves, many of them too sick to march or speak, lived their lives in the shadows of factories and courtrooms. Their suffering, ordinary and continuous, became the unspoken background to debates carried out in distant capitals. When you reflect on this stage of the story, you are left with a question that echoes beyond Bhopal. How much suffering is acceptable in exchange for progress, for profit, for industrial growth? And who gets to decide? As the immediate shock of the gas leak faded, a new struggle began, one far slower, quieter, yet no less devastating. If you were a survivor in Bhopal in the weeks and months following December 3rd, 1984, your world had changed, but not in ways that were immediately obvious to the outside observer. The streets were cleared, the cremations completed, and the media moved on. Yet for those who had inhaled the invisible poison, the effects lingered, insidious and relentless, touching nearly every aspect of daily life. You might wake up in the morning, expecting that time had healed, only to find your lungs still burning, your vision blurred, your eyes red and swollen. Children, once energetic and playful, grew listless, coughing constantly, struggling to keep up with what had once been ordinary routines. Pregnant women feared the health of their unborn babies, some discovering in the months after that miscarriages were far more common than before. Even young adults, who had survived without immediate visible harm, found themselves plagued with fatigue, respiratory problems, and cognitive difficulties that no doctor seemed fully equipped to treat. Medical professionals began documenting these effects systematically, though progress was slow. Early reports noted a sharp increase in respiratory illnesses, eye infections, and neurological problems among those exposed. Hospitals, already overwhelmed during the disaster, continued to receive patients suffering chronic symptoms. Doctors found themselves forced to improvise, treating conditions they had not encountered before, using therapies that provided only partial relief. There was no single antidote for methyl isocyanate. There were only attempts at palliative care, monitoring, and hope. One striking observation was the intergenerational effect. Children born to exposed parents often carried congenital defects or suffered developmental delays. Researchers studying the city noted higher rates of stillbirths and infant mortality in the years immediately following the disaster. Families discovered that the gas had not only claimed lives directly, but had left a hidden legacy, altering the health of those who survived and the generations that followed. Parents would describe watching their children struggle to breathe, their small bodies marked by illnesses that seemed inherited from the air itself. Yet the survivors' suffering was compounded by social and economic difficulties. Many had lost family members who had been primary breadwinners. Widows and orphans struggled to maintain homes, feed children, and find work. The compensation provided by Union Carbide, and later by government settlements, was often delayed, insufficient, or tied up in legal disputes. For those living on the margins, every day was a negotiation between the physical limitations imposed by exposure and the pressing demands of survival in a city where opportunities were scarce. The environment itself remained hazardous. Though the gas had dispersed, the soil and water around the plant retained toxic residues for decades. People who had thought they were safe found that the very water they drank, used for cooking and bathing, was a slow-acting poison. Families who returned to the neighborhoods near the factory discovered that plants withered, cattle grew sick, and groundwater, once taken for granted, could not be relied upon. Environmental cleanup, when attempted, was slow and often inadequate, leaving residents to develop their own coping strategies. Some relied on bottled water, if they could afford it. Others dug deeper wells, hoping to escape contamination, only to find that toxic compounds had penetrated further than anyone realized. In these years, Bhopal became a laboratory for both tragedy and research. Scientists from around the world came to study the long-term effects of chemical exposure on human populations. Epidemiological studies documented respiratory and eye disorders, neurological damage, and reproductive issues. Surveys revealed patterns in chronic illness, shedding light on how a single event could have cascading effects on human health. The city, once ordinary, became a case study in disaster medicine, toxicology, and environmental science. Meanwhile, survivors organized themselves. Grassroots groups and advocacy organizations formed, aiming to monitor health outcomes, provide legal support, and demand ongoing medical attention from authorities. They documented symptoms, compiled case histories, and pressed for accountability, knowing that the passage of time could obscure evidence and diminish claims. These organizations became the voices of a population largely ignored by the media, insisting that the world remember the human consequences of industrial negligence. You might imagine walking through these neighborhoods years later. Children who had survived the initial exposure now attended schools, though some struggled with learning disabilities linked to the gas. Parents, many physically debilitated, worked in small shops or as laborers, managing pain, fatigue, and respiratory challenges alongside economic survival. The physical landscape bore scars too. The factory, though partially abandoned, remained a looming presence. Contaminated soil, stagnant ponds, and rusting tanks reminded residents daily of the disaster that had struck decades before. International attention waxed and waned. Some humanitarian organizations funded clinics, research, and clean water projects. Others campaigned for stricter global regulations on chemical storage and industrial safety. Bhopal became a symbol, not just of negligence, but of the way poor communities are disproportionately exposed to industrial risk. Conferences and reports cited the city as a case study, debating how to prevent similar disasters in other parts of the world. In this way, the human suffering of Bhopal had a broader impact, shaping policy discussions far beyond India's borders. Yet despite the studies, the clinics, and the advocacy, many residents continued to struggle with daily life in a poisoned city. Treatments were expensive, and government support uneven. Survivors described the frustration of hospitals running out of supplies or specialized care being limited to certain clinics. For some, the damage was permanent. They learned to pace their breathing, to avoid exertion, to recognize the early signs of respiratory distress. Every cough, every eye irritation became a reminder of the invisible chemical that had infiltrated their lungs, their bodies, and their lives. Psychological effects were equally profound. Survivors carried trauma that did not fade with time. Parents who had lost children could not easily return to normal routines. Children who had witnessed death in the streets struggled with nightmares and anxiety. The city itself carried collective memory. Empty streets where bodies had lain, silent neighborhoods once filled with chatter and commerce. This psychological burden, intertwined with chronic physical illness, created a layered experience of loss that extended far beyond the immediate disaster. Researchers studying Bhopal over decades documented these long-term effects in detail. Respiratory illnesses, including chronic bronchitis and asthma-like conditions, were prevalent among survivors. Eye problems, including corneal damage and blindness in severe cases, persisted for years. Neurological complaints, headaches, dizziness, cognitive deficits affected both adults and children. The chemical had, in essence, rewritten the health profile of an entire city, leaving scars invisible to the casual observer but devastating to those who lived them daily. In parallel, environmental studies revealed that soil and groundwater contamination persisted for decades. Heavy metals, pesticide residues, and MiC derivatives were found in water wells, fields, and even in the tissues of animals living near the plant. Cleanup efforts were fragmented and slow, hampered by bureaucratic delays, insufficient funding, and legal disputes with Union Carbide and its successors. Residents often had to take matters into their own hands, digging alternative wells, filtering water, or relocating when contamination became apparent. Bhopal thus became a cautionary tale in multiple dimensions: medical, environmental, social, and legal. It illustrated how a single disaster could ripple through decades, affecting lives, livelihoods, and ecosystems in ways that were difficult to anticipate and even harder to remediate. And it reminded the world of the limits of industrial oversight when profit and convenience override precaution. You, listening now, can reflect on the magnitude of this ongoing struggle. The disaster did not end with the visible release of gas or the immediate deaths. It continued silently, in hospital wards, in contaminated wells, in the nervous systems of children born years later, and in the exhausted bodies of survivors striving to live ordinary lives. As the years passed, questions lingered. Could better medical infrastructure have mitigated the long-term health crises? Could international oversight have prevented the contamination of soil and water? And most fundamentally, how do societies weigh the promise of industrial progress against the potential cost to human life and the environment? Bhopal offered no simple answers, only the unfolding of consequences that stretched over decades and generations. The legal aftermath of Bhopal was a battle that stretched for decades, marked by delays, disputes, and partial victories that often felt hollow to the survivors. If you imagine yourself in the shoes of a parent who had lost a child or a spouse that night, the thought of having to fight in courts sometimes thousands of miles away was both exhausting and surreal. Yet it was unavoidable. The world had noticed the tragedy, and the machinery of law would become another arena of survival, another front on which Bhopal's victims had to exert energy they barely had left. Immediately after the disaster, the Indian government took steps to assert control. The Bhopal Gas Leak Disaster Act of 1984 granted the government the authority to represent the victims in all legal matters. This meant that individuals could not sue Union Carbide directly. Their claims were channeled through a government-appointed body. On one hand, this was meant to streamline compensation. On the other hand, it placed survivors at a further remove from the process, and decisions about settlements were largely out of their hands. Union Carbide, headquartered in the United States, maintained that its Indian subsidiary was primarily responsible, attempting to limit liability and reduce financial exposure. The company initially suggested sabotage by a worker or some unforeseen technical failure. Investigators would later disprove the sabotage claim, showing instead that a combination of neglected maintenance, faulty safety systems, and procedural shortcuts had caused the disaster. Yet corporate denials delayed meaningful restitution. In 1986, 2 years after the disaster, the Indian government filed a lawsuit in the United States, seeking approximately $3 billion in damages. This amount reflected both the scale of the loss, 25,000 deaths, tens of thousands of injured, widespread environmental contamination, and the need for long-term healthcare and rehabilitation. Union Carbide countered with jurisdictional arguments, claiming that the case should be heard in Indian courts. These legal maneuvers extended the fight for justice for years, leaving survivors in a limbo of uncertainty. Eventually, in 1989, an out-of-court settlement was reached for $475 million. On paper, this was a resolution. Yet in practice, it was only the beginning of another struggle. The compensation amount, when divided among the vast number of victims, was small. Many survivors received only a fraction of what they needed to cover medical expenses, lost income, and the psychological impact of their losses. Delays in dispersing funds created further hardship. Some families waited years before receiving even minimal payments. The legal terrain was complicated by bureaucracy and corruption. Local officials, lawyers, and middlemen often delayed or misdirected funds. Forms had to be filled out repeatedly, medical evidence submitted countless times, and appeals filed for minor disputes. For survivors already weakened physically and emotionally, navigating this labyrinth of paperwork and court appearances was nearly impossible. Many gave up entirely, accepting partial settlements simply to survive. International attention continued, though it was inconsistent. Human rights organizations, environmental groups, and journalists reported on the slow pace of compensation. Some called for Union Carbide executives to face criminal charges, arguing that corporate negligence should have personal consequences. Others focused on the Indian government's responsibility, criticizing delays and mismanagement in distributing funds. Amid these debates, the victims remained the constant, silent reference point, living reminders of the disaster, their suffering ongoing while legal arguments raged. Court cases continued well into the 1990s and beyond. New lawsuits targeted the successor company, Dow Chemicals, which had acquired Union Carbide in 1997. Survivors argued that liability should carry over and that Dow should contribute to medical care, environmental cleanup, and rehabilitation programs. Corporate defenders insisted that Dow had no legal obligation, as it had acquired only the assets, not the historical liabilities. This legal argument became a source of frustration and anger for survivors, many of whom saw it as a refusal to acknowledge the human cost of industrial negligence. In parallel, criminal cases were slowly moving through Indian courts. Union Carbide officials, some still in the United States, were charged in absentia with culpable homicide and criminal negligence. These cases dragged on for decades, often dismissed or delayed due to jurisdictional challenges and procedural hurdles. Eventually, in 2010, 7 Indian executives were convicted, though the sentences were widely regarded as insufficient. Many survivors felt that justice had been denied, the punishments disproportionate to the scale of the tragedy. Amid the legal wrangling, the survivors themselves became organizers, activists, and advocates. Local groups coordinated medical camps, documented ongoing health problems, and pressed both government and international bodies to act. They kept the memory of Bhopal alive, insisting that 25,000 deaths and countless chronic injuries be recognized not merely as numbers, but as individual lives impacted. Their activism helped to establish research centers, clinics, and awareness campaigns that continued for decades, providing practical help while also maintaining pressure on legal and corporate institutions. One of the most remarkable aspects of these struggles was the persistence of ordinary people. Women, in particular, emerged as leaders in the advocacy movement. Widows who had lost husbands and children carried petitions to courts, organized protests, and coordinated relief for neighbors. Their work ensured that Bhopal remained in the public consciousness, and that pressure on both Union Carbide and the government never entirely lapsed. In a sense, the survivors' resilience became a form of justice in itself, a slow, determined refusal to allow the disaster to fade into obscurity. Environmental lawsuits also became a part of the legal narrative. Communities sued for the contamination of soil, water, and local ecosystems. Studies showed persistent pollution from chemical residues, affecting agriculture and water quality. While cleanup operations were initiated, progress was piecemeal. Court interventions often mandated partial remediation, but large areas around the factory remained contaminated well into the 21st century. Residents developed informal strategies for survival, filtering water, avoiding certain wells, relocating livestock, while the courts debated responsibility. These intertwined legal battles, civil, criminal, environmental, highlighted a key tension: the distance between law and lived experience. While judges debated liability, survivors continued to live with the consequences of the disaster daily. Every cough, every eye irritation, every miscarriage was a living testimony to the insufficiency of delayed settlements. Legal victories felt abstract, almost ceremonial, compared with the immediacy of suffering in Bhopal's neighborhoods. And yet, these battles also forced reflection on the larger global systems that enabled such disasters. Bhopal became a case study in industrial oversight, international corporate responsibility, and the ethics of chemical production. Universities, think tanks, and international organizations referenced the legal disputes repeatedly, analyzing the delays, settlements, and structural failings that compounded human suffering. Students of history, law, and environmental science often cite Bhopal as an example of how accountability is negotiated not always effectively across borders, industries, and legal systems. For you, reflecting now, the lesson is multifaceted. The disaster itself was immediate, but the consequences are long-term. Legal battles, court cases, settlements, and activism became part of the ongoing struggle for survival. 25,000 deaths were only the beginning. The law was supposed to mitigate further suffering, but it often fell short. The survivors' persistence, their insistence on recognition, and their continued advocacy transformed the narrative of Bhopal from a single catastrophic night into decades of human resilience, resistance, and insistence on justice. As decades passed, the question lingered: can legal systems ever adequately compensate for the scale of human suffering caused by industrial negligence? And what does it mean when settlements, court rulings, and fines feel disconnected from the lived realities of the people most affected? These questions remain unresolved, a haunting echo of that night in December 1984 and the legal aftermath that followed. Even decades after the gas leak, Bhopal's environment remained haunted by the disaster. If you were walking through neighborhoods near the Union Carbide plant years later, you might notice the quiet unease that hung in the air. The city's streets had returned to a semblance of normal life. Children played, markets opened, and vehicles moved along familiar routes. Yet the soil, the water, and even the vegetation retained a hidden legacy. Invisible toxins lingered, and with them, the memory of that night in December 1984. The chemical responsible, methyl isocyanate, had dispersed into the atmosphere, causing immediate deaths and injuries. But other chemicals stored at the plant, pesticides, heavy metals, and their byproducts remained, seeping into the soil and groundwater. Wells near the factory, once relied upon for drinking and irrigation, became sources of chronic contamination. Residents reported foul smells, discolored water, and a persistent bitter taste. Many households were forced to rely on purchased water, though not everyone could afford it. This environmental crisis layered itself atop the health crisis, making everyday life precarious, even for those who had survived the initial gas exposure. Environmental surveys conducted in the years following the disaster revealed alarming details. Toxic residues were found in the topsoil, in ponds, and even in the tissues of livestock that grazed nearby. Crops, grown in contaminated soil, often absorbed dangerous chemicals, introducing the toxins into the food chain. Farmers found yields diminished, livestock weakened or deformed, and wells unusable. People who had returned to their homes faced the cruel reality that the very ground beneath their feet, once familiar and safe, was now a potential source of disease. Attempts at cleanup were slow and fragmented. The Indian government, Union Carbide, and later Dow Chemicals initiated remediation projects. Yet the scope of contamination was vast, and coordination was often poor. In some cases, hazardous waste was simply moved from one area to another, rather than being safely neutralized. Residents reported trucks dumping waste on open land, only to find it seeping into water sources months later. Grassroots monitoring became essential, with local organizations tracking pollution levels and advocating for more comprehensive cleanup efforts. The health consequences of ongoing environmental exposure were profound. Even individuals who had escaped the gas cloud that night began to report illnesses linked to contaminated water and soil. Skin rashes, gastrointestinal problems, respiratory infections, and neurological complaints became common in neighborhoods surrounding the factory. Doctors documented chronic kidney disease, liver damage, and cancer linked to prolonged exposure to chemical residues. These problems were compounded by the lack of infrastructure for long-term medical care and the limited availability of specialists in Bhopal. Children born in the years after the disaster often suffered developmental challenges and congenital anomalies. Schools noticed higher rates of absenteeism, learning difficulties, and chronic illness among students living near contaminated areas. Families learned to adopt coping strategies, boiling water, avoiding certain wells, and limiting outdoor play for children. Yet these measures could only reduce exposure. They could not eliminate it. The city had become a landscape of caution, where daily life required constant negotiation with invisible hazards. Environmental scientists began to study Bhopal as a case study in chemical disasters. Detailed mapping of contaminated sites, groundwater tests, and soil analyses became standard research projects. Scientists documented not only the chemical concentrations but also the patterns of human exposure. They tracked how toxins traveled through water systems, into crops, and into human bodies. Bhopal provided evidence of how industrial negligence could create long-lasting environmental damage, showing that disasters of this kind are rarely confined to a single day or event. They unfold over decades. The environmental crisis also spurred policy discussions. International bodies began debating stricter industrial regulations, chemical storage standards, and emergency preparedness plans. Bhopal became a reference point in global discussions about corporate responsibility, highlighting the consequences when companies fail to maintain safety systems or adequately monitor hazardous materials. Industrial nations studied the disaster to learn what regulatory frameworks might prevent a similar tragedy elsewhere. Within the city, residents adapted as best they could. Community groups dug new wells or installed filtration systems. Health campaigns advised families on safe water and food practices. Yet the city's environment retained a permanent scar. Children grew up hearing warnings from parents, not about traffic or natural disasters, but about the invisible chemicals in their own neighborhoods. Ordinary life became a constant balance of caution and necessity. The factory itself remained a symbol and a source of ongoing danger. Tanks, pipelines, and storage containers that had caused the disaster were partially abandoned, yet some were still accessible. Environmental audits often highlighted improper containment and leaking residues. Legal efforts over decades pressured the government and corporations to remediate, yet progress was piecemeal. Residents sometimes discovered buried chemical waste in their backyards or local parks, a chilling reminder that the disaster was not confined to a single moment in history. Medical research in Bhopal expanded in scope. Hospitals and research institutes tracked thousands of patients, documenting chronic respiratory illness, eye disorders, neurological deficits, and reproductive health problems. Studies revealed correlations between long-term exposure and increased rates of certain cancers, kidney and liver disease, and developmental challenges in children. International journals published findings, and Bhopal became a reference point for toxicology and environmental health studies worldwide. Researchers emphasized the lesson: disasters are not measured only by immediate fatalities, but by prolonged effects on ecosystems and human populations. Social dynamics also changed. Neighborhoods near the plant saw declining property values, economic stagnation, and population shifts. Some families relocated to escape contamination, others could not afford to move. Trust in industrial and government institutions eroded. Generations of Bhopalis grew up aware of the fragility of public safety, witnessing firsthand the consequences of inadequate oversight and the challenges of holding corporations accountable. Activism continued alongside medical and environmental studies. Survivors organized campaigns demanding permanent medical facilities, long-term monitoring of environmental toxins, and comprehensive cleanup of contaminated areas. These efforts often intersected with legal battles, as compensation for environmental damage became part of broader settlement claims. Community organizations also focused on education, teaching children about chemical safety and preparing citizens to respond to industrial hazards in the future. Internationally, Bhopal influenced chemical safety protocols. The disaster became a cautionary tale cited in United Nations reports and global environmental conferences. Governments around the world reviewed their storage and emergency response policies, implementing stricter regulations for handling hazardous materials. Chemical manufacturers studied Bhopal to develop improved safety procedures, yet critics argued that without enforcement, lessons often remained theoretical. For you, observing this complex legacy, the lesson is clear. Industrial disasters do not end when the immediate event is over. They persist in soil, water, bodies, and collective memory. The 25,000 who died were only the first casualties. The survivors lived with ongoing exposure, chronic illness, and psychological trauma. Environmental contamination ensured that the tragedy unfolded not just over days, but over decades. As Bhopal's story continued into the 21st century, the city became both a warning and a testament. A warning of what can happen when industrial progress outpaces safety, when profit is prioritized over people. A testament to human resilience, to the families who survived, the activists who organized, the doctors who treated, and the researchers who documented and learned. The city's struggle is both historical and contemporary, a living case study of the interplay between human error, corporate responsibility, environmental stewardship, and the enduring spirit of those who continue to live with the consequences. In reflecting on this, you might ask, can any legal settlement or cleanup ever truly restore what was lost? Can a city recover fully from an invisible poison that infiltrates every aspect of life? Or is Bhopal a reminder that some disasters are measured not only in immediate deaths, but in decades of human and environmental cost? Lessons that persist quietly in the daily routines of those who remain. If you step into Bhopal today, or imagine walking through its streets in the years after the disaster, you would encounter stories of survival, resilience, and quiet determination that often go untold in headlines and textbooks. These are the personal narratives that make the tragedy tangible, that allow you to understand how ordinary lives were irrevocably reshaped. Survivors became living archives of that night in December 1984, their bodies and memories carrying the imprint of gas, loss, and struggle. Consider for a moment a mother who survived the initial gas leak only to lose her husband and 2 children. Her house, once filled with laughter and everyday chores, became a silent witness to absence. She struggled to care for herself and for any remaining family, while simultaneously navigating hospitals, bureaucracies, and compensation claims. Her days were punctuated by persistent coughing fits, burning eyes, and fatigue that never fully lifted. She learned to ration water carefully, to avoid contaminated wells, and to walk cautiously past abandoned plots near the plant that still released chemical residues. Yet within this struggle, she found a rhythm, a determination to survive and care for herself and neighbors, to transform grief into action, and to ensure that her lost family would be remembered. Stories like hers were echoed across the city. Children who had witnessed the deaths of classmates and neighbors struggled to return to school, carrying both physical effects and psychological trauma. Some children never regained full health. Others were born after the disaster, with congenital abnormalities caused by parental exposure. You, as an observer, can imagine the subtle, cumulative effects. Children learning to walk and talk while their lungs burned, while eyes throbbed, while sleep was punctuated by nightmares of a night that no one could forget. Each small act of learning, of growing, of simply breathing, became a demonstration of resilience against overwhelming odds. Survivors also organized. Neighborhood committees formed to track ongoing health issues, to provide emergency medical care, and to advocate for environmental cleanup. Women, particularly widows, became leaders in these efforts. They coordinated clinics, documented the sick, and pressed local and national authorities for recognition and support. These grassroots movements were crucial. They kept pressure on governments and corporations, ensuring that the 25,000 who had died, and the countless more whose lives were changed, were not erased from public consciousness. The city itself, over time, adapted to the disaster. Schools incorporated health education into curricula, teaching children about chemical hazards and safe practices. Public spaces became reminders of past dangers, whether through community memorials or environmental monitoring stations. Markets reopened, but vendors and shoppers carried the lessons of caution with them. The ordinary rhythms of life, shopping, cooking, walking to work, were now intertwined with vigilance and awareness. This was not dramatized heroism, but quiet, daily survival, a form of resilience that is easy to overlook but central to understanding the human response to catastrophe. At the same time, Bhopal's story reached a wider audience. International attention waxed and waned over the years, but the disaster became a touchstone for environmental justice, industrial responsibility, and human rights advocacy. Academic studies documented the long-term medical effects: chronic respiratory disease, eye damage, neurological impairments, reproductive complications, and intergenerational health problems. Environmental studies highlighted the persistent contamination of soil and water. Policy discussions around the world reference Bhopal when considering chemical safety regulations, emergency response protocols, and corporate liability. The city's experience became a lesson for policymakers, scientists, and industrial planners alike. Disasters do not end when the initial event subsides. They echo across years, decades, and generations. Legal struggles remained central to survivors' lives. While settlements provided some monetary relief, the process was slow, bureaucratic, and often inadequate. Survivors testified in court, wrote petitions, and participated in international advocacy campaigns. They challenged both Union Carbide and Dow Chemicals, demanding recognition of responsibility and compensation for environmental and health impacts. Despite partial victories, the survivors often faced disappointment. Compensation did not fully cover medical costs, long-term rehabilitation, or the social consequences of the disaster. Yet they persisted, demonstrating a collective resilience that became a defining characteristic of the city itself. Bhopal's cultural and social landscape shifted as well. Neighborhoods adapted to the loss of families, friends, and community structures. Religious and social rituals were altered to accommodate the scale of mortality. Memorials and ceremonies became essential, not only as tributes to the dead, but as mechanisms for coping with collective trauma. Literature, film, and journalism documented personal narratives, bringing human faces to statistics. You, as a listener, can imagine how these cultural expressions served both as remembrance and as a bridge between the local experience and global awareness. In reflecting on the disaster, you would notice the duality of tragedy and resilience. 25,000 lives were lost, yet the city persisted. Survivors transformed suffering into advocacy, grief into community engagement, and caution into expertise. The disaster shaped generations, influencing education, healthcare, urban planning, and industrial regulation. The human capacity to endure, adapt, and act became a central theme in Bhopal's ongoing story. Global lessons emerged alongside local resilience. Bhopal became a case study in disaster preparedness and corporate responsibility. Governments revised industrial regulations, chemical safety standards, and emergency response protocols in response to the tragedy. Multinational corporations reviewed storage and handling procedures for hazardous materials, attempting to prevent similar incidents. Bhopal's experience highlighted the interconnectedness of local vulnerability and global industrial systems, showing that negligence in one corner of the world could have consequences visible across continents. Yet the disaster also posed unresolved questions. Could any level of regulation have fully prevented the tragedy, given systemic pressures and cost-cutting incentives? Could legal settlements ever adequately compensate for decades of chronic illness, loss, and environmental damage? How should societies weigh the risks of industrial progress against the potential costs to human life and the environment? These questions remained open, continuing to challenge policymakers, corporations, and communities alike. The human dimension, however, remained central. Survivors adapted, innovated, and supported one another. Community clinics offered treatment for ongoing respiratory, eye, and neurological issues. Local activists ensured monitoring of contaminated sites, documented ongoing health problems, and pressured authorities for improvements. Schools incorporated awareness programs, teaching children about chemical hazards and civic responsibility. Ordinary acts sharing water, caring for sick neighbors, advocating for proper cleanup became the quiet backbone of the city's recovery. Even as decades passed, Bhopal's memory endured. Monuments and memorials reminded citizens and visitors alike of the disaster, offering places to reflect, mourn, and learn. Annual commemorations ensured that the 25,000 who died were not forgotten. Public consciousness maintained the lessons of industrial safety, human resilience, and community solidarity. In these ways, the city itself became both archive and educator, a living lesson in the consequences of negligence and the possibilities of perseverance. Finally, Bhopal stands as a symbol of layered historical consequences. The immediate catastrophe of December 1984 was only the beginning. Legal battles, medical crises, environmental contamination, and social restructuring unfolded over decades. Ordinary citizens became advocates, scientists, and teachers. Cities, governments, and corporations grappled with responsibility and policy reform. Each layer of this history is essential to understanding not only the disaster itself, but the human and systemic responses that followed. If you reflect on Bhopal's legacy, you see more than tragedy. You see the persistence of human life against environmental and systemic adversity, the ingenuity and courage of survivors, and the ongoing importance of learning from past mistakes. The city's story reminds you that history is not only a record of dramatic events, but also of long, quiet struggles for survival, for justice, for health, and for memory. As you consider all of this, you might ask yourself, how do societies honor the lives lost while preventing similar disasters in the future? Can compensation, policy change, and public awareness ever fully account for the human cost of such tragedies? And finally, how do ordinary people, caught in extraordinary circumstances, shape the course of history simply by surviving, remembering, and acting? Bhopal offers no simple answers, only the unfolding evidence of human resilience in the face of one of the 20th century's most devastating industrial disasters.